The war in Ukraine is not just being fought with tanks and missiles. It's a battle for the very future of freedom. And as President Zelenskyy flies to Washington, the world holds its breath, because what happens next could decide whether democracy stands tall or whether dictators rewrite the rules of our century. Volodymyr Zelenskyy's upcoming flight to Washington is not just another scheduled diplomatic trip. It is an event layered with urgency, symbolism, and the weight of history. When a leader at war leaves his own country to step into the halls of another power, the message is clear. This is not routine diplomacy. It is a mission born out of necessity. Ukraine has been under relentless assault for years, its sovereignty challenged and its people forced to fight not only for their land, but also for their very right to exist as a free and independent nation. In that context, Zelenskyy's visit to Washington is a reminder that Ukraine cannot and should not stand alone. This journey carries with it the hopes of a nation under siege and the expectations of millions who look to the United States as a decisive player in shaping the future. The trip comes at a moment when the war has reached a critical stage. The Alaska summit between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin did not produce a ceasefire, leaving the battlefield unchanged and the suffering ongoing. For Ukraine, that means the conflict remains a daily grind of attrition, with no guarantee of outside relief. By traveling to Washington, Zelenskyy is not simply making an appearance, he is directly appealing to America's role in global leadership. This is about demonstrating that Ukraine's fight for survival is tied to broader questions of international order, democracy, and the principles that hold alliances together. If Ukraine falls, it would not only embolden Russia, but also send a signal to other authoritarian powers that military aggression can redraw borders without meaningful resistance. What makes this visit particularly significant is its timing. After Merz's statement that the United States is prepared to be part of Ukraine's security guarantees, the political atmosphere has shifted. No longer is the discussion solely about military aid, financial packages, or sanctions. The stakes are about long-term commitments, guarantees that Ukraine will not be left vulnerable again, and assurances that the West, led by Washington, is serious about standing against aggression. Zelenskyy's presence in Washington will put a face to those commitments, a reminder that behind the headlines are soldiers, civilians, and families fighting to live free. This trip is also symbolic for American politics. When Zelenskyy arrives, it will test how Washington wants to be remembered in this moment of history. Does America stand as the guarantor of freedom, willing to shape a world where alliances matter and aggression is punished? Or does it step back, retreating into hesitation, leaving others to carry the burden? The Ukrainian president's arrival forces these questions onto the table in a way no press release or official statement could. It humanizes the issue and makes it impossible for leaders to ignore. In short, Zelenskyy's flight to Washington is more than travel. It is a deliberate act of diplomacy under fire. It underscores how high the stakes have become, not only for Ukraine, but for the entire world watching. This is about survival, leadership, the test of whether promises made in words will be matched by action in deeds. When Friedrich Merz stated that the United States is ready to be part of Ukraine's security guarantees, he set the stage for one of the most important geopolitical shifts in recent years. For months, if not years, Ukraine's supporters have debated what lasting protection should look like once the guns eventually fall silent. Aid has flowed, weapons have been supplied, and sanctions have been imposed, but none of that has fully answered the ultimate question: what happens next? Security guarantees are not short-term fixes. They are promises that bind nations together in defense of principles and territory. When Merz revealed that Washington is prepared to take part in such guarantees, signaled that the U.S. is no longer content with symbolic gestures or distant support, but is ready to anchor itself in the security architecture of Europe once again. The meaning of this cannot be overstated. For decades, the credibility of Western alliances has rested on America's willingness to be more than just a participant, to be the backbone of collective security. By stepping into Ukraine's future guarantees, Washington is reaffirming its central role in ensuring that Russia does not simply pause today only to attack tomorrow. It shows that the U.S. understands the lessons of history. Appeasement and half measures do not stop aggressors, they embolden them. If the United States is willing to commit itself to Ukraine's long-term security, it transforms the conflict from a temporary crisis into a defining moment of deterrence. For Ukraine, this is more than reassurance. It is survival. Security guarantees from Europe alone would not be enough. While nations like Poland, the Baltic states, and Germany can promise solidarity, the hard truth is that only Washington's involvement gives such guarantees real weight. Russia fears American power in a way it does not fear individual European countries. The presence of the U.S. in any guarantee system tells Moscow that the cost of future aggression would be unbearable. That message, spoken clearly and backed by American capability, is the strongest possible deterrent. Merz's words also carry political symbolism beyond Europe. They tell the world that America, despite its internal divisions and shifting leadership, remains willing to act on the global stage. The announcement shows that the transatlantic alliance is not fraying, but rather being redefined in real time, with Ukraine at the center. For countries watching from Asia, Africa, and Latin America, this is a powerful statement. The United States is still the partner of choice when freedom is under threat. Of course, such guarantees are not without risks. For Washington, involvement means greater responsibility and a potential for direct confrontation if Russia were ever to test those promises. Yet leadership has always carried risk. The alternative, stepping back and leaving Ukraine vulnerable, would invite a far greater danger by encouraging Russia and others to push boundaries even further. In this sense, Merz's revelation reflects a choice: he face short-term political risk today or endure a long-term collapse of international order tomorrow. By declaring that the U.S. is ready to be part of Ukraine's security guarantees, Merz has illuminated what the next chapter of this war could look like. It is not just about fighting for territory, but about creating a lasting framework where Ukraine's independence is protected, aggression is deterred, the free world proves it still has the resolve to defend its values. This shift marks the difference between uncertainty and commitment, between words and action, between fragile hope and lasting security. The Alaska summit between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin was expected by many to at least slow the pace of war or provide a foundation for meaningful negotiations, but it ended without a ceasefire. That single outcome, or rather the lack of one, has sent shockwaves through diplomatic and security circles. The absence of even a temporary pause in fighting underscores just how far apart the sides remain. It highlights the brutal reality that Russia has no intention of stepping back from its campaign of aggression. For Ukraine, this was a sobering reminder that no external meeting, no handshake across a table, can substitute for the hard truth on the ground. Every day without a ceasefire is another day of casualties, destruction, and displacement. The lack of progress at the summit also shines a light on the fragile state of global diplomacy in this conflict. Major powers can meet, they can talk, and they can issue statements, but unless those conversations are backed by enforceable commitments, they are little more than theater. Putin emerged from Alaska without making concessions. That alone suggests he believes he still holds leverage. A ceasefire would have meant freezing the battlefield, halting advances, acknowledging that Ukraine's defenders had successfully resisted. By refusing to agree, Moscow sends the message that it is not finished, that it intends to continue testing Ukraine's endurance and the West's unity. For Washington, the summit's failure to deliver a ceasefire carries its own implications. It puts greater pressure on American leaders to show that diplomacy is not the only card on the table. Words without results can weaken credibility, and Zelensky's upcoming visit to Washington now becomes even more critical. The Ukrainian president is walking into an environment where talk has produced little, but action is desperately needed. The timing is symbolic. One summit failed, and now another meeting, this time between the U.S. and Ukraine, could redefine the path forward. The absence of a ceasefire also sharpens the urgency of security guarantees. If fighting continues unchecked, promises of future peace mean little without enforcement mechanisms. Ukraine cannot wait indefinitely for symbolic gestures while its cities are bombarded. The failure in Alaska, therefore, strengthens the case for Washington's direct involvement in a more permanent arrangement. Because without firm commitments, Putin will interpret Western diplomacy as weakness. In that sense, the lack of a ceasefire does not just prolong the war, it raises the stakes for what comes next. Beyond Ukraine, the world is watching. Other nations see that even a high-profile summit between the leaders of two nuclear powers could not stop the violence. That reality can either fuel despair or sharpen resolve. For allies in Europe, it is a warning that they cannot afford complacency. For smaller nations across the globe, it is proof that security cannot rest on words alone, but must be guaranteed by credible commitments. The Alaska summit's inability to secure a ceasefire leaves the conflict not at a crossroads, but on a razor's edge. It sets the stage for Zelensky's Washington visit to be more than symbolic. With no pause in the fighting, Ukraine needs guarantees, resources, and leadership. The failure of diplomacy has opened the door for stronger action, and the world will now look to see if the United States is ready to step through it. For Ukraine, security guarantees are not just diplomatic language or lofty promises. They are a matter of survival. In a war where entire cities have been reduced to rubble, where families live under constant bombardment, and where the very existence of the nation is being challenged, the difference between freedom and subjugation comes down to whether the country can secure lasting, enforceable protection. Aid packages and weapons shipments are essential, but they are reactive. Security guarantees are proactive, ensuring that Ukraine is not left vulnerable to another wave of aggression once the current war reaches a pause. They represent the shift from short-term relief to long-term stability, from uncertainty about tomorrow to a framework that can safeguard future generations. The weight of these guarantees comes from the lessons of history. Ukraine has lived through broken promises before. The 1994 Budapest Memorandum, in which Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal in exchange for security assurances from major powers including Russia, stands as a painful reminder of what happens when guarantees lack teeth. Russia's violation of that agreement in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, its subsequent full-scale invasion in 2022, revealed the devastating cost of trusting paper assurances without concrete enforcement mechanisms. That is why Zelenskyy and his government now push so forcefully for guarantees that are binding, credible, and backed by nations with the strength and resolve to uphold them. Anything less risks repeating past mistakes. For the Ukrainian people, guarantees are the psychological lifeline that tells them their sacrifices are not in vain. Soldiers fighting on the front lines need to know that their country's independence will not be bargained away in some future deal. Civilians rebuilding their lives need the confidence that peace, when it comes, will not be shattered by another invasion in 5 or 10 years. Guarantees are more than words in a treaty. They are the assurance that children can grow up in a Ukraine that is free, democratic, and secure. Without them, the shadow of war will linger, and every reconstruction effort will feel temporary. From the perspective of the broader international community, Ukraine's demand for guarantees is not unreasonable. It is a test of whether the global system built after the Second World War, with its emphasis on sovereignty and territorial integrity, still means anything. If a country can be invaded, devastated, and left with nothing but vague promises, then the credibility of international law collapses. Security guarantees for Ukraine would therefore serve as a statement to the world that aggression will not stand unchallenged, that borders cannot be changed through brute force. There is also a practical military and strategic dimension. Guarantees backed by the United States and NATO would deter Russia from launching future attacks by raising the cost of aggression beyond what Moscow could bear. Without such commitments, Ukraine is left to rely on its own strength, a tall order for a country already drained by years of war. The difference between guarantees and no guarantees could determine whether Ukraine thrives as a stable democracy or remains a permanent battlefield. In essence, security guarantees embody the line between hope and despair. For Ukraine, They mean the chance to move beyond survival and into a future of stability and sovereignty. For the world, they mean proving that promises matter and that freedom, once defended, will not be abandoned. Without them, the war may never truly end. With them, Ukraine gains not just peace, but the chance to live free from the shadow of constant fear. For America, the question of global leadership lies at the heart of Ukraine's struggle. Every decision taken in Washington reverberates far beyond Kiev or Moscow. It shapes the perception of whether the United States still has the resolve to act as the guarantor of international stability. For decades, American leadership has been defined by its willingness to step forward when others hesitate, to marshal alliances, and to serve as the central pillar of collective security. The war in Ukraine is not just another regional conflict. It is the clearest test in a generation of whether the United States intends to remain the leader of the free world or retreat into a posture of cautious detachment. Ukraine's plight makes this choice unavoidable. If America treats the defense of Ukraine as optional, other nations will interpret that hesitation as a signal that U.S. commitments are conditional, temporary, or negotiable. That would be devastating not only for Europe, but also for regions like East Asia, where allies rely heavily on Washington's pledges of protection. Leadership is not measured by speeches or symbolic gestures, but by the willingness to bear risks and responsibilities when the moment demands it. In Ukraine, that moment is here. The world is watching. The stakes extend far beyond the battlefield. If the United States steps back and leaves Europe to manage Ukraine's security alone, it would embolden Russia and potentially invite new aggression elsewhere. It would also encourage other authoritarian powers to test the limits of U.S. resolve in their own regions. On the other hand, if America commits decisively, whether through security guarantees, increased support, or a clear declaration of long-term partnership, it reaffirms that its role as global leader is not in question. Such leadership would not only protect Ukraine, but also send a message of deterrence across the globe. This is not without cost. Leadership requires resources, political will, the acceptance of responsibility. Critics often argue that America cannot police every conflict, that its resources are finite, and that domestic priorities should come first. But global leadership has always involved trade-offs. The alternative, retreating from commitments and allowing aggressors to shape the world order, would ultimately be more costly. If dictators succeed in one region, they will push further, and the instability that follows will inevitably draw the United States back in, only under worse conditions and with greater risks. The symbolism of Zelensky's visit to Washington ties directly into this question. His arrival forces U.S. leaders to confront the reality that leadership cannot be deferred. It demands clarity. Either Washington stands firm with Ukraine as part of a broader defense of freedom, or it risks signaling weakness that adversaries will quickly exploit. For Zelensky, the visit is about survival. For America, it is about identity, whether it will continue to shape the international order or allow others to define it. At its core, America's global leadership is about more than military power or financial aid. It is about setting the moral and strategic tone of the world. If the United States chooses to lead in Ukraine, not only strengthens the defense of one embattled nation, but also reinforces the principle that freedom and sovereignty are non-negotiable. If it chooses not to, risk ceding the very values that have defined its role in the modern era. The decision is as much about America's place in history as it is about Ukraine's future. Vladimir Putin's strategy in Ukraine has always hinged on one central calculation, that the West will fracture. He is betting that democratic nations, with their competing interests, short election cycles, and internal divisions, will eventually tire of supporting Ukraine. This is not just a military conflict for him. It is a psychological and political one. He knows that Russia cannot match the combined military and economic power of the United States and its allies. What he can do, however, is try to exploit divisions, drive wedges between nations, and erode the will of the coalition supporting Kiev. Every delay in delivering weapons, every debate in parliaments, every protest against aid is viewed in Moscow as a sign that Western unity may not hold. This is why the potential commitment of the United States to be part of Ukraine's security guarantees is so significant. It strikes directly at the heart of Putin's gamble. For months, he has relied on the idea that while Europe might be determined, America could hesitate, especially with shifting political winds in Washington. If the U.S. were to step back, the burden would fall heavily on European nations already stretched by energy crisis, inflation, and the pressures of housing millions of Ukrainian refugees. That scenario would play perfectly into Putin's hands, reinforcing his belief that time is on Russia's side. But if Washington signals unequivocally that it is in this for the long haul, the entire equation changes. The addition of U.S. weight to any security framework makes it vastly more credible. Russia would no longer be testing the endurance of a divided West, would be facing a unified transatlantic front anchored by the one nation it knows it cannot intimidate militarily or economically. Such a move would collapse Putin's strategy of division, robbing him of the hope that internal disagreements could achieve what his army has failed to secure on the battlefield. The psychology of deterrence is as important as the military balance. Authoritarian leaders often thrive on the perception that democracies lack resolve. When they see hesitation, they push further, confident that free societies will not endure prolonged sacrifices. But when they encounter unity and commitment, their calculations shift. A firm U.S. role in Ukraine's future security would demonstrate not only resolve but also continuity, that no matter the debates in Congress or changes in leadership, America's core alliances and principles remain intact. That is a powerful message not just to Moscow, but to Beijing, Tehran, and any other capital considering testing the West. Putin's bet on division also extends to the Ukrainian people themselves. He hopes that doubt among their allies will sap morale, that uncertainty will weaken resistance. By contrast, clear and credible commitments from the United States would strengthen Ukrainian confidence that their sacrifices are not in vain. It would tell them that they are not fighting alone, that the world's most powerful democracy stands beside them in defense of their sovereignty. In the end, Putin's strategy of division is a gamble on weakness. The only way to defeat it is through unity and clarity of purpose. America's willingness to join Ukraine's security guarantees would signal that the bet has failed, that the free world is not splintering, but solidifying. Such a commitment would not just shape the outcome of the war, it would define the broader contest between authoritarian aggression and democratic resilience in the 21st century. And so, as Zelenskyy steps into Washington, it is more than a meeting between presidents. It is a turning point for the world. The stakes are clear. Ukraine's fight is freedom's fight. America's choice is history's choice. If the United States leads, the free world stands unbreakable. If it falters, the door opens to chaos and conquest. In this moment, hesitation is surrender. Leadership is victory. And the question that echoes tonight is simple: why will America rise to the challenge or watch the future slip away?